On air 24/7. This is today's News Talk TNT.
Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to this live broadcast. We're still in the first hour here. I'm your host, Patrick Henningsen. Thank you so much for rejoining us. And as mentioned before the break, I want to welcome a very special guest onto the program right now. He is the former British ambassador to Syria and Bahrain. His name is Peter Ford. He's joining us on the live link right now. Peter, absolute pleasure to have you with us today.
Hello, Patrick, and it's great to be with yourself and TNT Radio.
Last time you were on this program, it was audio. Of course, we're in vision now, so it's great to see you. And Peter, you know, you did a very, I thought, interesting and important interview recently, which was published on Dissident Voice. It was conducted by Rick Sterling, an American journalist, and it was about the U.S. and Israeli plan to basically upend and, you know, replace or destroy UNRWA, the UN Relief and Works Agency. And Peter, we just saw the most horrific strike on a shelter only a couple of days ago that must have killed, by our count, at least 30 people that I can see so far. This was a shelter. This was a known UNRWA facility. Often schools and other hospitals and so forth are recognized by the UN and the international agencies as shelters during times of war. So these are known quantities for the IDF, yet they disregard them as we've seen time and time again. And the results are horrific. I don't know when this is going to end, Peter, but you brought up some important points. I think it's important that you explain to our audience exactly what is going on with UNRWA. They've been demonized. They've been called Hamas terrorist-linked organization, despite any evidence to prove those charges. But it started a process, didn't it, Peter? Tell us the story and why this is crucial.
Yeah, well, UNRWA is very central to the whole issue because it's the UN Relief and Works Agency for Palestine refugees. The words are important. Palestine, why not Palestinian? Because when the agency was set up, there was a country called Palestine. It had been taken over by the British from the Turks. It was a country. It was an entity, even though it was controlled from London. And the British then handed it over, more or less, to one segment of the population. And the Palestinians got the short end of the stick. But there was a country called Palestine. And these people, millions of them fled. Sorry, not millions. In those days, it was about, I think, half a million fled because of ethnic cleansing. They fled to neighboring countries, and they fled to Gaza, and they fled inside the former Palestine territory to the West Bank. But they had a country. They lost their country. So the mere existence of UNRWA is a reminder that there was a country called Palestine, and there might in the future be a country called Palestine, and not one limited to the approximately 28% of the historic territory of Palestine that was supposed to be handed over to the indigenous inhabitants, the Palestinians, but the entire territory of Palestine. And there's another important word here, refugees. These people in the refugee camps are refugees. This is often overlooked. We got a form of blindness to the fact that these people are already refugees. They were expelled violently from their country, and they and their descendants are now the people that UNRWA serves. And UNRWA exists to provide services to the refugees and their descendants, services like basic education, and healthcare and housing, other social infrastructure. So the mere existence of UNRWA is intolerable to Israel. It's a reminder, A, that there was a country called Palestine, which the Israelis now occupy, and there are people of refugees who have, I was forgetting to mention this, a right of return under international law. The people who were expelled and their descendants have a right of return. That includes a right of return to what is now Israel. So this has always been the most difficult issue in the protracted negotiations in the days when there was a Middle East peace process. The right of return was always going to be the most intractable of the issues. And the mere existence of UNRWA keeps this question alive, keeps it on the agenda. You see, what Israel would like is to bring about the entire collapse and elimination, not just of Hamas, but UNRWA, because UNRWA is a piece of grit in their wheels. And as long as UNRWA is there, the question of Palestine will be there.
And Peter, your personal experience with UNRWA, this international agency, it goes back a few years. I mean, you sort of cut your teeth in the Middle East, working with UNRWA in Lebanon, in the Palestinian camps at the time. Just explain to us your experience in those days, and then what types of conditions are these people having to work under right now? If you can kind of just give us a little bit of insight on that.
Yeah, well, right from the beginning of my diplomatic career in Lebanon, I saw at firsthand the good work that UNRWA was doing, and I always admired what they were doing. And I was very happy when towards the end of my diplomatic career, I saw an opportunity to join UNRWA. They were recruiting for a fundraiser and political advisor. And I had the necessary qualifications. In particular, I spoke Arabic, and I could therefore liaise with the rich donors in the Gulf who paid literally hundreds of millions of dollars to reconstruct Gaza after previous Israeli incursions. And I was instrumental in much of that. So I've been there, I've done it, I've seen it on the ground, how Gaza could be razed. Entire neighborhoods were previously razed. It wasn't on the wide scale that we're seeing today, but nevertheless, entire neighborhoods were razed, and Arab countries came along, and with our guidance, we rebuilt thousands and thousands of housing units and whole estates and infrastructure to go with that, and new schools and new healthcare centers. And I believe this can happen again. On the ground right now, UNRWA is forced to go back to its original purpose, which was to provide relief. See, in its title, it's the UN Relief and Works. The works were the good stuff, the nice stuff, the schools, the hospitals. Relief was the tents, the food, and that's what they're doing now. There's no education going on, except perhaps on a private level. The healthcare centers have been mostly bombed out, but there's still a huge amount being done in terms of distributing food and providing shelter in the bombed out schools and healthcare centers, makeshift arrangements. And this is what UNRWA are doing. And this is being done by Palestinian staff. This is the other thing the Israelis always hated about UNRWA, that the majority of staff, over 90% of the staff, are Palestinians. And it's basically Palestinian self-help with a UN veneer. The international staff who provide most of the senior management are there to well, to raise funds for all this and to provide guidance. But it's the ordinary Palestinians, the teachers, the doctors, the people building houses who are doing the brunt of the work. And right now in Gaza, they're doing virtually all the work.
So what you're describing here, Peter, is UNRWA is really the lifeline. It's the main oxygen line for Gaza. And you've also commented in your excellent interview recently with Rick Sterling, Israel has incredible oversight and control, actually, over UNRWA and influence over what it can and can't do. So even with all of that control, Peter, even with all of that ability that Israel has to control everything, including the flow of funds at the end of the day, they still want to destroy this agency. So just explain to people exactly how that relationship works.
Well, it's always been a tense relationship. But the Israelis have had to recognize that in practical terms, if UNRWA didn't exist, the occupying power, would have to somehow look after these refugees. They couldn't just leave them to starve. Well, I say that. Things have perhaps changed. But until very recently, the Israelis grudgingly accepted that UNRWA was a necessary evil, and until they could figure out a way to perhaps get other charities, to other UN agencies to take on the work, that in the meanwhile they would have to have day-to-day reasonable working relationship with UNRWA. But they still had oversight over recruitment. They could still effectively, through the American partners, veto senior appointments. Not sure how I snuck in under the radar, but one or two got through. And they controlled, in particular, access for building materials. And going forward, this is going to become the day after, this is going to be the major issue, the entry of building materials.
Just kind of give people a little bit of perspective here, Peter. There's no, as far as I can see, the healthcare system in Gaza has been destroyed, as has the education system, including all the major universities. They were literally destroyed, bombed, blown up, explosives planted, controlled demolition in the case of at least one university that I saw on video. I mean, so that's a complete obliteration of major sections of society, the kinds of things that you just can't snap your fingers and build again in a week. So that's the reality on the ground right now. In addition to that, we see Israeli settlers being encouraged by the government to block aid deliveries that are coming by truck. In some cases, they're emptying the trucks and destroying the food and medical supplies and baby formula that's on board those trucks. I mean, have you ever seen such a thing, such a scene as this? And is there any condemnation or outrage from the international community? Peter, your thoughts on all this?
Yes, it's hard to exaggerate quite how awful it is. People are deprived of the most basic services. But the Palestinians are incredibly resilient. They are surviving. They're getting by day to day. And they're not buckling. They're not buckling. They have long experience of hardship. They're extremely resilient. And when the fighting is over, I have little doubt that they will very quickly reestablish a working entity in Gaza, and there'll be a lot of work to do for UNRWA in picking up the pieces. But in today's world, you can do a lot just on the internet. The kids can get something of an education, even if the physical buildings aren't there. Even health care to some extent can be delivered more online these days, as perhaps we learned during the experience of the COVID epidemic. Governments can exclude children from school for years on end and more or less stop people going into hospitals, but somehow people are resilient and they get through it.
So as far as UNRWA is concerned, Peter, and it is a essential lifeline for the Palestinian people, especially in Gaza. What is the future of UNRWA? While it's under attack in the way that we've seen, there's efforts still right now, active efforts to basically cut funding from it, to treat its employees and administrators as criminals or, terrorist associates and things like this. I'm talking about what the U.S. mainly and Israel are doing to the agency. How do you see, is it going to survive? And if so, what role can it play in Gaza?
Well, Israel has declared war on the UN system. Specifically, the brunt of its anger is UNRWA, but also the ICC and the ICJ. They're targeting even individuals in the way that for years and years they've targeted individuals they don't like in UNRWA. So UNRWA is not alone now. But the Israeli campaign isn't working, and to some extent is backfiring on them. There's a lot of sympathy in the world. Many countries that, in a knee-jerk reaction, cut UNRWA funding, have quickly re-established it. And there are some important laggards like Britain and America, but most of the donors have gone back to and resumed funding. And I'm sure they will all feel so guilty when the fighting stops that they will increase that funding massively. So UNRWA stands ready, and I think its role, I'm going to say something provocative here, but I believe true, that Gaza the day after will look very much like Gaza the day before. It will be a de facto condominium between Hamas and UNRWA. UNRWA is the second biggest employer in Gaza after the government, the Hamas-run government. And it's still that today, and that between them, they will pick up the pieces when the fighting is done, because there is no alternative. Realistically, there is no alternative. The Israelis have toyed with the idea, fantasized about creating a Quisling regime, about bringing in charities to do the work of UNRWA. These have been shown to be fantasies. And the Biden plan, despite its many shortcomings, does implicitly recognize this, as much by what it doesn't say, what it does say. But it does at least talk about withdrawal, and it doesn't talk about Hamas being replaced. And indeed, in the briefings, US spokesmen have more or less conceded that Hamas are going to remain in control. And they will do so inevitably with in a sort of partnership, uneasy partnership. UNRWA, with UNRWA, it was always uneasy because UNRWA had to keep at arm's length from Hamas. It was always extremely delicate. In particular, UNRWA could not tolerate any Hamas presence of any sort in its compounds, in the schools, or the healthcare centers. This is why I find it very hard to believe what the Israelis are claiming about the existence of Hamas compounds inside UNRWA facilities. That would go against decades of experience and be pretty stupid of Hamas anyway. And now I see these alleged compounds have been reduced to a porta cabin. Well, go figure.
Well, the initial claims by the Israelis that UNRWA was somehow, a nest for terrorist activity, and so they said something crazy like 30% of the employees were affiliated with Hamas or something like this. That these turned out to be proven fabricated claims. So there was no basis to it to begin with. But as you said, in a knee-jerk fashion, everybody was scared in the international community. Nobody wants to be supporting terrorism, as they say. But you have to take a realistic point of view here. As much as the U.S. and the UK would like to see Hezbollah disappear in Lebanon, or Hamas disappear in Gaza, or, you can have a bunch of other examples of this, the Islamic resistance in Iraq. These are all products. They exist for a reason. They became into existence for a reason. And they are, like it or not, these are the armed liberation struggles or the national self-defense units in the case of Hezbollah that are basically protecting their country or their people or trying to exercise their right to self-determination, Peter. So just by slapping the terrorism label on it, it might be politically expedient for Israel and for the U.S. and Britain and other EU countries, but the rest of the world, maybe the majority of UN members, don't see it that way. This is a huge disconnect, Peter, and I think this is at the core of this issue. Your thoughts on this?
This is where the Israelis have lost big time. Before this crisis, most of the world was prepared more or less to believe Israel, but those days are past. They've told so many lies. They've come forward with so much obvious propaganda, being pushed back now. Countries like Spain, and you see that a number of countries are recognizing the state of Palestine now. This is a slap in the face to Israel. It's a message from what's sometimes called the international community, a phrase I hate to use, but you know what I mean. It's a message to Israel that your Hasbara is finished. We don't buy it anymore. It doesn't work. And UNRWA is one of the beneficiaries of this new realization. These fantasies that the Israelis and the American administration have pushed, they're over. The fantasy that Hamas could be crushed, the fantasy that some kind of quisling regime, some supine client of Israel, maybe some Palestinian clan leaders would take over. One of the clan leaders was assassinated not long ago. That's not going to work. And the final fantasy, I'm very sorry to say, is the two-state solution. This is a big subject, but the Biden plan contains no kind of fourth element. It's about ceasefire, withdrawal, reconstruction. You might expect that there'd be a fourth element of a two-state solution. Well, even that has dropped off the radar because nobody believes it. They pretend to believe it, and that's what these recognitions are about. But it's a substitute for action. It's clear that the international community will not lift a serious finger against Israel. If they can't stop Israel committing war crimes, obvious, attested war crimes, how are they going to force Israel to give up territory for the creation of a Palestinian state? It's a fantasy and needs to be seen as such. It is a substitute. Countries like Europe, 11 European countries now recognize the state of Palestine. This is a substitute from them doing something serious, like sanctioning Israel, like closing the Israeli embassies. That would be serious. That would be painful. They're not prepared to do that. So they indulge in this cruel illusion that somehow they can magic forth a Palestinian state. That fantasy is one of the casualties of the Gaza crisis.
Yeah, and that's an important nuance in this discussion, Peter. I don't think that that's being addressed properly by a lot of leading commentators, including people in politics and I'm going to say diplomats, but I don't like using this word anymore, Peter, because I don't see a whole lot of diplomacy going on. And that's my final question to you, Peter. And again, I appreciate your time. I know because of the time difference in Europe, we're privileged to have you with us. But yourself, as a career diplomat, somebody who for a living build bridges between countries and leaders and communication bridges that people could understand each other and then come to some kind of amicable agreement on a whole range of issues, including war and peace in some cases. Why the lack of diplomacy? There's no effort to negotiate a ceasefire and any de-escalation in Gaza and also in Ukraine. I'm going to throw that in there as well, Peter, because I see the same pattern emerging. I want to get your comments on this and specifically about the UK government, the role it could play diplomatically, but has chosen to sit on the sidelines. Peter, your final thoughts on this key issue?
Well, diplomacy can make things worse as well as better. And I say that as a former diplomat. And this, the Middle East peace process, which was the ultimate diplomatic creation. Diplomats loved the Middle East peace process. You had the illusion of moving things forward, but in reality, you were just making the occupation permanent. Israel loved the peace process as well. They just got on with building their settlements, and Westerners applauded as long as the Israelis went along to the meetings and gave a minimum of cooperation to the quisling regime that they have on the West Bank. We all thought that was great. And it took 3 decades to get over that. And only then, because Netanyahu brought an end to it. If the diplomats have their way, we'll go back to another endless round of so-called negotiations where the stronger party obviously holds the upper hand against the weaker party, and the diplomats holding the ring just make things easier. So I'm not hopeful that the end of the Gaza conflict will see any serious effort by the diplomats, because there are none who are, that I know, prepared to face up to the realities. What matters now is first the military situation, the Palestinian resistance. The Israelis are not struggling because of the diplomats, they're struggling and failing because of the military resistance by the Palestine resistance. And the second thing is Biden's electoral prospects. He is in serious trouble with many of his core voters, the young, idealistic people who are performing heroics on campuses in the States. And that is making Biden come forward with some, to me, really quite surprising moves, like accepting the need for Israeli withdrawal. And this is the really important word. We've been talking about ceasefire. Ceasefire was never going to be enough. Ceasefire was just going to be like the peace process, just holding the ring while Israel get on with it. No, we don't. A ceasefire alone is counterproductive. What's needed is withdrawal. And this is as much as we can hope for, to force the Israelis out of Gaza and then work over the very long term for maybe an upheaval in the West Bank, producing a genuinely authentic popular government, maybe on the model of South Africa. We see a non-apartheid state emerge in the former state of Palestine, the one state solution, which I have, after many years of supporting 2 states, I've come around to the one state solution.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people are also in that camp now, more so than ever, Peter. Peter Ford, former British ambassador to Syria, thank you so much for joining us on TNT this week for this really important conversation.
Thanks for the opportunity, Patrick. It's been a pleasure.
No, thank you very much. There he goes, ladies and gentlemen. That is Peter Ford. Very important conversation, extremely important. We'll be following up on this in the coming days as well as the situation continues to become even more tenuous in Gaza. We'll give you up-to-the-date reports and information on that for Monday and Tuesday as well. Let's take a break right now with the network, and when we come back, your final thoughts and headlines coming up to the top of the hour. I'm Patrick Henningsen, your host. We'll be right back.
Anticipate potential delays for the morning commute. In other news, a recent government report on prescription drug pricing points to corporate
Freedom of the press is about your right to know.
Create offense is often.
What are you talking about, man? Look at his stats.
Clark sheer athleticism.
It's about your right to be informed. Your right to access all types of information keeps us free as a nation.
No.
Today, there are real threats to press freedom.
Residential areas by...
And your right to know about the world around us.
Look.
Some threats are obvious, some are easy to miss, but they all put our way of life at risk. We must defend against all of these threats, no matter what kind of news is important to you.
Justified putting American troops in harm's way?
That's a great question.
We must protect our right to know before it's too late. Understand the threats. ProtectPressFreedom.org.